You're listening to Raincoast Radio.
Welcome to More Than a Fish, Season 2 of Raincoast Radio. I'm Auston Chhor, a salmon habitat biologist at Raincoast and your host for this series of conversations about the connections between salmon, people, and place. Today, my guest is Tom Rutherford. Tom is the Strategic Priorities Director of the Cowichan Watershed Board and has been involved in watershed governance, salmon recovery, and community building for over 40 years. Tom is a masterful storyteller and communicator, so really grateful to have you on the show, Tom.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks, Austin.
So we start every episode with a concept that we're calling home waters. So as you know, salmon are inherently connected to their home waters, sometimes to, the exact square meter of their natal stream. And we want to hear about our guests' home waters. So for you, where are your home waters and what are they like?
So I live in the Kelvin Creek watershed, which is a small tributary of the Coxsila, which shares the estuary with the Cowichan River. So lucky enough to live in a watershed that supports salmon and sub-watershed of a river that supports a lot of salmon. So the Cowichan River has been or is something that really defines the community I live in and has done so for, I might say, millennia. I'm not an Indigenous person, but I'm lucky enough to work with Indigenous biologists and, folks from the Cowichan Nation. And my understanding is that the relationship between the people of this place and the river and the salmon that it supports is a very, very deep one that's perhaps impossible for me to understand as a Westerner, but it is certainly what defines the people that have always lived here and that still live here. Just a quick story about that, maybe. We're lucky enough to have a river that still gets hundreds of thousands of salmon coming back to it every year. So it's not unusual for us to get 150 to 200,000 chump salmon. And of course, these are fish that are 4 to 5 kilos, maybe. And to have that kind of a salmon run, not to mention the iconic Chinook run, right? To see these big fish coming back every year it's a real privilege, right? That not a lot of people have. And as a biologist, if you think about what that means to our watershed, right? If you do the math, that's over 1 million pounds of biomass that comes charging up the river every year in October, November. And then, if you or I were to walk up the river in January, you'd be really lucky to find like a jawbone. So all that biomass just gets sucked up into the ecosystem. And that's why it's such a great place to live with trees and eagles and bears and all that rich kind of coastal ecosystem is basically based on that salmon nutrient pump. So that's the watershed that I live in.
Is there a spot in the watershed that when your friends or family come from out of town that, you make sure that they see or experience?
There's a couple of places that I like to go. So from my home, I can walk to the Coxsila River. And one of the things that's different between the Coxsila and the Cowichan is the amount of groundwater influence in the Coxsila. So right now, it's like August the 11th, it's 30 degrees outside. The Cowichan is fed by a large lake, which is really helpful in a lot of ways, but it also is a huge heat sink. So the temperature in the Cowichan right now, as we speak, is 24 degrees. And if we were to look in a textbook and try and find lethal temperatures for rainbow trout, it'd probably say something like 25 degrees. So with climate change, with the advent of these longer, hotter, drier summers, the Cowichan is really, really balancing on this knife edge. The Coxsila, which is adjacent, the largest sub-basin, has a tremendous amount of groundwater influence. And if we were to walk over there now and put a thermometer in, it'd probably read 18 degrees. That's a huge difference in kind of back-to-back watersheds. And it shows the importance of groundwater and protecting our groundwater, but it's also a great place to swim. So one of my favorite places is to bring people down and jump in the river. And a lot of places in the world, you can't jump in the river because it's too polluted. So we're really lucky that that is not the case here.
Have you lived in the Coxsila for all your life?
No, that's a great question. So we moved here about just over 30 years ago, 31 years ago, and we moved from Haida Gwaii, where I had the privilege to live for 15 years. And I'll tell you, if you're a young salmon biologist that loves the outdoors, Haida Gwaii is wonderful. Like the people are great. It's gorgeous. The swimming and the diving and the fishing and the climbing are just outstanding. And I think the relationship between the Haida people and the non-Indigenous people and the leadership that the Haida people have shown, the thoughtful leadership, is truly exemplary. And it just makes it a wonderful place to live.
And after that many years, so over 30 years, is there something in the watershed that still to this day like doesn't get old? Like I'm relatively new to the coast. I'm from Ontario. I've moved out here 4 years, 5 years now. And I remember thinking, the first year I was here, like, okay, these mountains are they're gonna get old, and they're gonna, one day I'm gonna be like, oh, this is just the mountains, right? But to this day, I'm still, every time I see mountains or the ocean, I'm like, this will never get old, right? Do you have something like that for you?
Well, I understand what you're saying. I'm a mountain guy too. I just love mountains. But I think in this watershed, I mean, that's kind of a cheater question to ask a salmon biologist because it's the fish, right? And it's
Yeah.
all about the salmon. Just being able to walk down to the river and see these amazing creatures, right, who started here, right, as an egg in the gravel, who've traveled halfway to Japan and then come back here to the same place. Like it's amazing. Like I'm a scuba diver and I can get lost in the bottom of a swimming pool, right? And that these fish go halfway to Japan, find their way back to their natal stream in great numbers. Like it's amazing.
That's really great to hear as a, early career biologist, is to hear someone like you've worked with the fish for so long still speak about them with like, yeah, that they're just so amazing. They're so incredible. And I think that just highlights how cool they are and why so many people love them. So, Tom, you are the Strategic Priorities Director of the Cowichan Watershed Board. How do you explain to, let's say, your younger cousin or somebody off the street what a watershed board is?
You save the harder questions for later. So here's my take on that is that I'm a technical person, schooled in Western science. And some of my colleagues cringe when I say this, but I almost think we have enough science. Like we know what's going on and we know what we need to do, right, to make things better. And as a society, we can't seem to do it, right? We're not heading in the right direction, even though we know what the right direction is. So that's kind of crazy. So how do we fix that? So my take on that is we've got enough science. We don't have enough social science, right? We're not smart enough in how to use our knowledge to make the right decisions in order to protect the things that are important to us, like our water, like our watersheds, like our salmon. So how do you do that? And so after, 45 years of pushing that kind of boulder up the hill, my take is the people that are going to turn things around are the people that live in a place, right? The people that are best set up to protect and restore and nurture a watershed are the people that live there. And so really that's what the Watershed Board is about. It's about the people who live here creating a structure that allows us to work together collaboratively to make a difference, to move the needle. And so that's the work of the Watershed Board.
I was actually going to ask you later on if you think we have enough science. I have it written down here, so I'm really glad that you already brought this idea up because it leads into your work with the Watershed Board and this shift, I guess, towards more locally led decision making versus top down decision making from higher levels of government. And I was always curious about these kind of models because it seems like the Cowichan is one of the only, or it was one of the first watersheds to implement this kind of system where governance and decision making is led from the ground and from the community.
I think the power of the Watershed Board is the power of influence, right? There's no regulatory tool that supports a Watershed Board, but I think the trick of it is the partnership that it exemplifies. So the board I work for is co-chaired by the chief of Cowichan Tribes, the largest First Nation in BC, and the chair of the regional district. And that's a committed partnership to work together that's been in place for 15 years, with each partner recognizing the other one brings authority to the table. It's not the same authority, but it's authority, and recognizing that authority. And if you think of it, in 2010, when this started, that was a pretty gutsy thing for a nation and a local government to do. And I think that trust and that commitment is what drives this bus. And a quick story, we in 2017 hosted a workshop with leaders from both communities to really kind of dig into how we were going to do our business. And Chief Seymour at the time, Chief of Cowichan Tribes, the late Chief Seymour, brought up the concept of Natsamat Kwisiaistaka. So Cowichan teaching that speaks to a commitment, a strong commitment to work together. And it was kind of a privilege to be in that room because the Cowichan representatives at the table started having a conversation amongst themselves about whether the rest of us understood the level of commitment that required. And there were people in that room, Cowichan people I really respect, who said, no, they're not ready for this. They don't realize what this means. And Chief Seymour in the end said, yeah, we need to do this. We are going to do this. And that was one of those, chicken skin kind of moments when the hair in the back of your neck stands up and you realize you're part of something that's really special. It was the start of something I think that's been really meaningful for us. And it is one of the reasons why we've been able to get traction in dealing with some really challenging watershed issues.
Yeah, so around 2010, I just spoke with Murray Ned from the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, and he told us a story about how the LFFA was formed out of this good out of crisis, as a response to crisis kind of idea, where it was in response to the 2009 Fraser sockeye returns. Was this kind of the same story that helped the Watershed Board form?
Maybe a bit of a longer story, but I would say yes. And I would say our crisis was 2003. So 2003 was the first year where there wasn't enough water in the river for the Chinook salmon to swim upstream when they got home. And we ended up partnering with Cowichan Tribes, and we worked together, and we trucked spawning salmon upstream because there wasn't enough water. And at the time, the agency I was working for, DFO, went to the pulp mill, who extracts a fair amount of water, and said, sorry, boys, you're going to have to shut down, right? This is not right. And then the province stepped in and said, wait a minute, we manage water in this province. These guys have a license to take that water. If you want to let it go legal, speak to us. And then the union at the mill said, we're going to walk off the job because we don't want to be the ones to kill the river. And then Cowichan Tribes invited us all to their office and said very clearly, our river, our salmon, we will tell you what we want you to do. And everybody lawyered up. And there was some, table, thumping meetings. And after one of those in the parking lot at Cowichan Tribes, a bunch of us got together in the parking lot, shaking our heads and said, man, this really sucks. Like we're not getting where we need to go. And that was the start of these informal meetings between a disparate group of people who all had interests around water. And that became the Cowichan Stewardship Roundtable, which still meets to this day on a monthly basis. So 22 years later. Very early in that process, it became clear that water was a tough issue. And a pile of partners put money into the table till we had $500,000. And we engaged in a water planning process that came up with a Cowichan Basin Water Management Plan in 2007, which was a great plan. It won an award, and it was an awesome plan. It was great for holding open doors and breaking bookshelves and whatever. It was no one's job to implement that plan, right? It wasn't the feds, it wasn't the province, it wasn't the tribes. No one had the resources. So that plan called for an entity to be formed. And that entity was the Cowichan Watershed Board, which was formed in 2010. So that's kind of the backstory. The other thing I'd say is without really strong community leadership, this would not be possible. We've relied for the last 15 years on very strong leadership, on chief of council, and on the seniority board. We've been gifted with really visionary leaders who realize the importance of the partnership and the importance of our watershed. And without that leadership, none of this would happen.
The importance of these pre-existing relationships, I think, is really interesting because in other jurisdictions, when crisis happens and maybe there aren't these pre-existing relationships, has the potential to devolve into just fighting, right? And I think it's really interesting what's come out of Cowichan was that in the response to crisis, people were able to work together, right? And what were these relationships like before 2003? And why was the Cowichan so set up to respond well to the crisis and not, just freak out?
Well, to be honest, I think there was a fair amount of freaking out in 2003. And I think that was the start. And that was 22 years ago. And we've been working really hard since then. And I think the key to this thing is that work never stops. Right? It's never like, okay, we're partners now. We don't have to worry about it. No, working across interests, working between entities, that kind of partnership piece requires care and feeding constantly. You can't take relationships of trust for granted, right? They're very, very hard to create and they're easy to destroy. So I think one of the things the Watershed Board takes very seriously, and we make mistakes, right? I make mistakes. We all make mistakes, but we really invest a lot of time and effort into listening to our partners and trying to learn other ways of seeing things. Perfect example here. I've been taught by my Indigenous colleagues that they look at fish and water a bit differently, right? I was educated to think of these things as resources that we have to conserve and treat well and manage properly. They've been taught to think of these things as relatives, part of the family. And I just think back on my 45-year career, if I would have made some decisions about salmon the way I make decisions about my kids or my mom or my granny, I might have made different decisions, right? I might have made better decisions. So that's just one example of kind of opening your mind a little bit and working at a partnership to really understand different ways of looking at the same thing and accommodating that and listening more than talking.
Yeah, and how important was that community involvement of not just, the partners and the people using water and the people fishing for fish, but just the everyday people living in the valley, Indigenous and non-Indigenous? How important is it to involve them in this as well?
So that's a really super question, Austin. So my theory is there's not enough of us who are engaged professionally in this work to make any difference. Then in order to move the needle, we have to bring everyone along with us. Otherwise, we are going to fail, right? There's just not enough people, not enough time, not enough resources unless we bring the community along. And I'll give you an example of how we're trying to do that here. So I spoke to this, award-winning plan that had goals and objectives and about 100 actions and really detailed stuff. Like, for instance, in the estuary, references to heavy metals and eelgrass and E. coli and all these technical parameters. Our work plan is focused on a handful of targets, what we call targets, which are these broadly scoped, inclusive statements on where we want to go that are crafted to try and bring people along with us, whether they're a school teacher or a bus driver or a farmer. And so for the estuary, right, which has all these technical things we're working towards, the target is we want to be able to safely eat shellfish from Cowichan Bay. Right? Cowichan Bay is full of shellfish. They're poison. No one's been able to eat them for 50 years. That's craziness, right? There's no sense to that. Everybody can understand that. Whereas if I start, drilling down into whatever E. coli levels, people are their eyes are gonna glaze over. But everybody understands, man, this bay is full of poisonous shellfish. We need to clean that up, right? And there's a a lot of little steps incrementally to get there, but no one's going to stand up in a meeting and say, well, I think the shellfish should be poisonous. So I think the whole idea of bringing our community along with us is really important. And I'm glad you brought it up, right? Because without thought put into that, I think these kinds of efforts to do a better job of stewarding water and salmon and watersheds are doomed to failure, right? We need to bring folks along with us.
Well, that's kind of why I brought it up, is because I feel like it's something that's, in our field has been so challenging. As scientists, we're like really, really good at finding the root of the problems. And then I feel like we're really, really bad at communicating why we should care, or why people who aren't us should care about the problem and be worried and be, motivated to act. And like, that's one of the challenges I've had personally is, I work in all these really complex issues related to drought and salmon habitat. And when I talk to somebody, when I'm faced with the question like, oh, well, why should I care? That suddenly becomes a really hard question to answer, right? Without, I can delve into the whole ecological aspect. I can talk about, their importance to wildlife and ecosystems, but that takes a long time, right? And it's not everyone has that mental bandwidth to absorb that knowledge and then translate it to care.
I think you've nailed something that's really important. Not naming names, but many of the best scientists I've ever had the privilege of working with are kind of jerks, right? They're like really technical, they're really into their work, they're super competitive, they're really gifted, but they're terrible communicators. I mean, that's not their thing, right? That's totally fair. But what you said is really true. It's unfortunate because a lot of their work is not used to implement change because of that gap. And one thing I've learned working for the Watershed Board that's really opened my eyes is the importance of outreach and engagement. And I think people like us who are sort of grounded in the technical side of things often are a little condescending towards that work. Oh yeah, it's the people that go around telling stories, making pretty pictures. And you know what? That stuff is super important. And one of the ways we've managed to bring, like you say, a varied and disparate community along with us is through effective outreach and engagement. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. And I mean, none of these are my work. I love them, but I'm not smart enough to think up this stuff. We've had a series of watershed superheroes. So we've had Water Woman who shows up at fairs and kind of public events and CVRD council meetings and where you don't expect her, with her cape and her mask and the big W, right? And she talks about water. And we've had campaigns with, hosers, right? Talking about how it's really important, like not to have leaky hoses, right? And so they can segue easily into water conservation issues, right? And just a variety of really innovative outreach and engagement programs that speak to that widely kind of disparate population that you were talking to. So everyone is kind of curious and will, listen somewhat to what Water Woman has to say. You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to be a fisherman, right? It's kind of, oh, well, that's cool. And so I think any organization that has similar goals, putting time and resources into that engagement piece is how you're really going to, make a difference in your community.
Yeah, that reminds me of, have you ever heard of Mr. Floaty?
Oh, yeah.
So for the listeners, Mr. Floaty was a mascot, I think for the city of Victoria or the regional district, to try to raise awareness about wastewater effluent into the ocean. And this, I think he was a high school teacher. He dressed up as a piece of poo and just went, yeah, as you said, just like Water Woman, would go to these very serious events and venues and, try to spread the message in an approachable way. And I think, now he's retired because they finally are building or have built a wastewater treatment plant. And I think as scientists, it's hard to even comprehend that, right? As a communications tool. I mean, I can think of 10 ways that I can make a PowerPoint or write up a little technical brief, but all these more approachable communication tools aren't in our toolbox or traditionally weren't.
So I have to kind of name drop here. So my colleague in the Watershed Board who leads all our engagement work, is Jill Thompson. And I'll have you know that Jill is personal friends with Mr. Floaty.
Oh, that's
I
amazing.
know, right? Like, how cool is that?
That is very cool.
And last point here, our mascot, now we have a mascot as well, Stockwee, who is a 6-foot dancing Chinook salmon. So when you see a 6-foot dancing Chinook salmon enter a room, you pay attention, right? Probably even better than Mr. Floaty.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to talk about a little bit about what's happening right now. And there's a lot of news that's coming out of the Cowichan, and you kind of alluded to it with water temperature earlier, and we're all feeling it right now. Today in Vancouver, it's 35 degrees, and I work in the Nicola where, it's not rained in ages and is very, very hot. So without, me spilling too much, what is happening in the Cowichan right now, and why is it a big deal?
Okay, well, I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to talk briefly about what happened in the Cowichan in 2023. So in 2023, we had an unprecedented fish mortality event in the river, and we were not expecting it. Perhaps we should have been, but we weren't. And so estimates are 100,000 salmonids died in the river. So the top 10 kilometers of the river was a death zone. And that was a visceral, like, gut punch to our community. And my board, as I said, is, community leaders, chiefs and counselors and, public health officers and people who are leaders. And there were tears at our board table. This was a really traumatic event for us as a community. And as staff, our marching orders were do something. Well, that's easy. We'll do something about climate change, right? So I think in true watershed board fashion, we didn't run around and buy a bunch of equipment or do a study. We approached the Salmon Foundation, who in fact provided us with the resources to bring people together. And we hosted a couple of workshops with subject matter experts who were grounded in the Cowichan, from the agencies, from the community, from Cowichan tribes. And we looked at two things. The first one is, we were surprised by this. How can we be better prepared? How can we see this train coming down the tracks at us? And so we put together a monitoring plan, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But the best monitoring plan in the world is useless unless you can respond to it, right? So we also put together a response plan. So what are the levers, if any, that we can pull if we see the train coming down the tracks? So that was the fall and winter 2023, 2024. So last year, we implemented both our monitoring plan and our response plan. And this year, we've improved upon it. And I would say none of those partners that were involved in the collaboration had the resources to do this. None of them. But they each had a piece of it. And so when we came together again in a collaborative partnership, we were able to get the resources and the manpower and the equipment to do this collaboratively. And everybody has skin in the game. Everybody had some resources of different types, right? It could have been manpower or equipment or expertise or knowledge. So we put together a monitoring plan that involves 6 continuous monitoring stations from the upper watershed to the lower watershed, which you can download the data by kind of walking by with your tablets, all kind of Bluetooth stuff. And Dr. Ken Ashley, who's recently retired from BCIT, water quality salmon expert, provided us with a lot of support and advice pro bono, which was awesome. Like, he is the national authority on water chemistry and salmonids and wastewater management. And so Ken has called our monitoring system the best in the country. I'm not sure if that's true, but it's a lot better than what we had before, which is nothing. So what we've set up is every week we have what we call a situation room meeting on Monday morning. We had one this morning, 8:30, where everyone comes together. We have the data right in front of us and we make decisions. And we don't always agree. So there's some animated conversations around that. So the decisions are on the response plan. So the second workshop we had was to try and figure out what the heck can we do. And we identified 4 levers we can actually pull. The first one is water management. So the Cowichan is a managed system with a weir on the lake. So we actually have some control We don't have the control over how much water we have behind the weir, but we have control over how we manage what's there. So that's one thing we can adjust.
The Cowichan Lake Weir holds back water at Lake Cowichan, which is at the head of Cowichan River. The weir is owned and operated by the Catalyst Paper Mill, which it uses to store water in the lake for industrial use. More recently, agreements between the Cowichan Watershed Board and the paper mill have allowed for ecological considerations to be taken into account in their day-to-day weir operations. For example, if flows downstream are getting too low due to drought, the weir can release water from the lake to temporarily boost flows in the river.
Secondly, we have 2 effluent plants that release effluent into the river. So we can control how they operate. And they've always been operated by permits, never exceeded their permits, but this is 2025, right? Things have changed. The third thing that we can manage a bit is access to the river. For instance, sport fishing, right? The Cowichan is a world-class sport fishing river. If it's really warm, perhaps we shouldn't be fishing. And the last thing that we're really leaning into is cold water refugia. So there are groundwater inputs into the Cowichan. So when we're running like today, we're running 24 degrees. There are areas where the temperature is 14 degrees, right? These aren't large areas, but we're really leaning into mapping these, identifying them, identifying what the temperature is like, how large the area of influence is, with the goal of, one, protecting them. So using existing legislative tools to do a better job of protecting these areas. And secondly, enhancing the impact of that cold water on the fish habitat. So kind of more up your alley, what habitat modifications can we implement in the river to create larger back eddies or those kinds of things so that cold water can have a greater impact on fish habitat. So those are the levers we can pull. We can change the way we manage our water, and we're doing that. For instance, this spring, we restricted the amount of water in the river to a level that probably negatively impacted smoltbout migration. And we did that knowingly because we only had so much water. And our choices in the past have been, well, we're going to ding the juveniles or we're going to ding the adults trying to get up the river because we'll have used up all our water. But now there's a different variable. It's like we're going to do this or we're going to do this or everything's going to die. So you kind of want to avoid the everything's going to die. So we sort of took a hit early in order to try and maintain a little bit higher base flow in the summer. So that's an example of how we're making really hard decisions using the information we have from our monitoring program to try to tweak the system a little bit to benefit fish and fish habitat and avoid another fish kill. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
No, that was a great answer. But I want to bring up the almost like elephant in the room where I've been working in the Nicola too, and we're always thinking about water for fish, and same thing that you were just talking about in the Cowichan was, all these things that we could do to have more water for fish. But we know that, it's not just the fish that need the water, right? You have agriculture, you have, in the Cowichan, you have the mill, you have municipalities. And so, who makes the decisions to prioritize water, right? When we have this scarce resource getting less and less every year, how are we prioritizing how we share that increasingly scarce resource?
So good question. And I might shift to the watershed I live in, the sub-basin, right? The Coxsila for that. Because in the Cowichan, we've got this system, and then we're working on what I call a long-term like techno fix. Because we have the big lake and because our climate has changed, that we're really getting hotter, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters. We're losing our snowpack, but we're getting a lot of rain in the winter. So the idea is if we could store a little more water in the spring, when we have tons, we could let that out in the summer. So that's a long-term infrastructure project that's really dedicated towards mitigating the effects of climate change and providing water for everybody. In the Coxsila, we don't have that option. Same problem, right? Not water. There's no large lake. So the only other lever to pull is, well, then we're going to have to change how we use our water and how we use our land, which is what you were kind of referring to. So in the Coxsila, Cowichan tribes and the province, supported by the Watershed Board, are engaged in the province's first water sustainability planning process. So this is a tool under the new-ish Water Sustainability Act that's never been used, and you're aware of it with your experience in the Nicola, right? Because there's that just started down the road there. And in fact, the Nicola Nation and the Cowichan Nation have done exchanges and are working pretty closely. So that's a really nice partnership. But an example of what's going on in the Coxsila right now, as in the Nicola, agriculture uses a fair amount of water. And agriculture is very important, right? Because it's producing food. And we have very progressive farmers in the watershed. They're great neighbors. They're my friends. They need water too. I get that. But there's a lot of pressure. So right now, because flows in the Coxsila are extremely low, what the farmers have agreed to do voluntarily is the major irrigators have split themselves into two teams, and they irrigate 4 days on, 4 days off. So rather than irrigating 24/7, which is what they're set up to do, like the farmers turn the pumps on for 4 days and then turn the pumps off, and then the other set does the same thing. So they're only using half as much water. So they're keeping their crops. It's not as good for them, but they're close to finishing off their corn, right? It's like the 11th of August, so another week or so. So they're voluntarily changing their behavior, right, in order to leave more water in the river. So that's just one example of the kind of change I think I'm talking about, right? Where we need to understand where everyone is coming from and work with each other to try and move that needle. And we're not confident we're heading in the right direction, but we're confident that the status quo is not good enough. So we need to change. We need to try things.
It almost sounds like it's like a very good exercise in democratic process. You're actually engaging and empowering people who live there to make decisions or have influence over decisions that impact the places where they live. You know, if I were living in Cowichan, I feel like that would make me more engaged and involved citizen, right? Just that act of being empowered to be listened to almost. And that's something that maybe in other places people don't feel like they have a voice, right? And how have you found that the communities responded to this, right? Given more influence, more power, more empowerment?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty astute observation. Like, no one wants to play unless they feel they can make a difference. And so I think in this watershed, and I mean, the challenges here are the same as anywhere else, right? They're not going away. But I think that our local leadership, through their engagement in the Watershed Board, are feeling like they can make a difference. And I feel like the people that live in this watershed are seeing that, and hopefully seeing that they have a voice or they have a conduit to kind of people that can be influential and that are listening to what they have to say. Because I think that's one of the big challenges we have is just instilling a sense of hope, right? There's a lot of bad news out there. And once you start demonstrating success, then I think people pay attention and they start to have that, sense of hope. And I can't overstate how important I think that is. And so that's another reason why having or placing some importance on outreach and engagement and celebrating success is really important. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that. And we have had some successes, right? And so I think that's what you can build on and what we're building on.
On that topic of hope and success, what are some of those things that we can be hopeful for? Because as a younger scientist, there are a lot of things that make me feel super unhopeful, right? That we've got no chance. We're not doing a great job. And are there things out there that, you can speak to that could lift my spirits a little bit?
Sure. So I think one thing we all have to realize, and I believe I said it earlier, is that things aren't going to be the same, right? They're not going to be the same. Here in our watersheds, I used to be a backcountry skier, and on Heather Mountain at the top end of the lake, there was always several meters of snow. Last time I was up there a few years ago with my son and our avalanche probe, which is 2.1 meters. That was probably 5 or 6 years ago. We sunk that thing down. There was no bottom. The last few years, there's been very, very little snow. And the Pacific Climate Impact Consortium scientists out of UVic have modeled, and I think it's good science, that by 2080, there'll be no snow ever in the watershed. So things aren't going to be the same. However, I think they can still be okay, but we have to realize that we need to engage, and we need to work at things we didn't have to before. But we can do that. Like the first 25 years of my career, I was kind of a non-interventionist, right? I was one of those guys that said, if we just stop screwing up, salmon are resilient, right? Watersheds are resilient. We just have to stop screwing up and destroying everything, and it'll be fine. I don't think that anymore. I think now people like me and more people like you who are younger have a responsibility to think about this stuff and to intervene. And my sense of it is we need to be a little less risk averse in our work and your work as a restoration biologist, because the biggest risk is not doing it, right? Because we know if we don't do anything, we're hooped. So we need to use the skills and the education and the training we have to actually start intervening, I think, with a long-term vision of what this place is going to look like 50 years from now, which is going to be different. And if you'd have told me 25 years ago that I would be working really hard to pour a bunch of concrete in a salmon river and build a weir, I would have told you you were crazy, right? But I believe that's what we need to do to ensure salmon's sustainability in this watershed. So there's hope. There's a lot of hope, but we can't be complacent.
That's interesting to hear from you, because I feel like as a younger person, a lot of these, I've been to a bunch of these planning tables, salmon ecosystem table, and it's usually, myself and a couple other younger colleagues who are the ones that are like, we should be doing something. I've read a report from 1980 that's saying the same thing that we're talking about right now, and it's 2025. And there just seems, that there's this either institutional or just this risk aversion to trying stuff. How can we convince the people who are holding the levers to let us do these things, right? These, like, maybe they're experimental, maybe they're more radical. Yeah, what can we do?
That's a great question. And certainly the people you're referring to are super dedicated, super smart, very knowledgeable. So I'm not criticizing them. I'm just looking at kind of the world through the Tom lens and just seeing how much things have changed in the last 45 years. So if you look at where salmon were in 1980 when I got my first job, and you look at where they are now, my career has been just a horrible failure. Horrible failure. Like, things were much better off. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's probably not all my fault, but I just have this sense of urgency. And it's a balance, right? It's a balance between studying things so you're probably doing the right thing, and studying things forever and not doing anything. And so somewhere in the middle is that sweet spot where you're not doing things that are uninformed, but you are doing something and you're learning from it. And I think that's key. My sense is that people have more comfort supporting things that might be a little bit on the outer edge of the comfort level if the project is properly assessed. So I think if you or I are trying to pitch something that's pushing the envelope, you just have to really stress that we're going to learn from this, and we're not going to do this and walk away. We're going to follow up and see. And we need to do that kind of work. Like here, the perfect example is now we're starting to know exactly where these cold water areas are, and we're mapping them, and we're going to try and work with legislative tools to protect them, whether they're like in BC parks or on private land forestry or on reserve or private property owners. Like, there are things we can do or try and do to protect them. But we should also be able to make better use of this cold water. And so this year, there's a partnership between Fisheries and Oceans Canada, right, the restoration crew in Nanaimo, Cowichan tribes, which we're supporting, that's really looking into this and trying to come up with some concepts for in-stream work that we hope to implement next year. And I can't speak highly enough of the DF4 restoration crew, which is out there on the river and doing this work. And it's a young crew, right? These are people maybe, well, your age, right? Like, and they are really giving it, and they're super smart and super capable. And that's where our future is.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring this cold water refuge idea up because it's actually something I'm working on in the Coldwater River in the Nicola. And like I'm going out tomorrow for the week. We've been mapping these refuges with drones. And something we always talk about in the field is okay, so now we find them, we know they're important. Can we make them better, right? What do we do? And I think that like it's really encouraging to hear that there's this appetite for action, for trying things, for taking a little bit of risks. Is this a mindset that's changed over the course of your career, where we're now, as things are getting more dire, a little more open?
Yeah, that's a good question, Austin. I'm not sure. I mean, my sense of it is that when my career started, government agencies had a fair amount of money and a fair amount of capacity. And people talk about peak oil. I often talk about peak government. And I think government capacity peaked out in the mid 90s. And ever since then, it's been dropping. And so other entities like nations and NGOs and consultants working for nations and NGOs have kind of stepped in. But I see that trend reversing, at least here on the South Coast, like on the island, where we've really got a bunch of good young people working for the resource management agencies that are like really talented in that they write well, they know how to find money, they like working in the field. And so I'm really hopeful. And I'm not sure why that's happened and if that's happening everywhere, but I think it might be, right? Because there's been quite a shift in the demographic, right, of resource management agencies. And so I am like cautiously optimistic that this young kind of demographic of people that have entered into positions where they can actually make a difference is really going to make a difference. And certainly what we're seeing here on the island and the support the Watershed Board and Cowichan Tribes is getting, I think it has really picked up a notch. Yeah, I'm really thankful for that.
You've done this for over 45 years. Something that I really admire is how have you been able to do this for 45 years? Right? This is not an easy job. It's not a job that is normal where you could just set it down at the desk and not think about it on the weekends. What's kept you going, for this long? I'm 27, right? You've done this for almost twice as long as I've been alive. How can I do this for the next 45 years? What can I learn from you?
So first of all, I have to fess up. I'm not jumping out of helicopters and swimming rivers as much as I used to. But you know what? I mean, I feel so privileged to be able to make a living at something that I really enjoy. And I have a lot of colleagues that are friends, I should say, like people I don't work with, but good friends who have to drag themselves out of bed every day to go to work and who were just looking forward to retirement like crazy. Like that's not me. I've retired twice and I'm still working, right? Because it's fun. And also and maybe I'm deluding myself here, but I think it's meaningful. Like it's good if you can support yourself in a way that you enjoy, that also you think is actually kind of doing something positive, perhaps for, society in general. And I think the kind of work we do in the best case, like you can check all those boxes. So I wouldn't be surprised. Like you don't want to ruin your life, but I wouldn't be surprised if when you're really, really old like me, you're still working. That might not appeal to you, but I'm just warning you.
So you brought this up earlier, and I remember you saying this very clearly at the PSF conference. So you said, I've been working for 45 years and my career has been a failure, right? Like because of the outcomes that have transpired over the course of your career. And whether that's true or not, what's some advice you can give to young people so that, in 45 years, we're not the ones up there on the stage going, oh man, like I failed, right?
So I think I was in a better position when I started than you are now. Not to be cruel, but I think there's a little more pressure on you now, a little more kind of urgency because there was abundance, right? And we squandered it. I guess a couple things come to mind. One is, don't ignore what's happened in the past, right? There are a lot of lessons there. And I think that if The people that are involved in salmon stewardship and management now really pay attention to the lessons learned, that your lives will be easier. And the idea of this shifting baseline, right, is something that I think about a lot. We need to be cognizant of that. Quick story. In 1981, I had the privilege of working on the Cowichan River, which is a major tributary of the Skeena that enters the Skeena Terrace. And there's a run of Chinook that swim up the Skeena, up the Cowichan, and it gets the Cowichan Lake, which is a large kind of lake. And they do so in the springtime. And then they hold in the lake all summer and spawn at the end of the summer. And we were in a program where we were capturing these fish and tagging them, and they're monsters. Like, I was handling 80-pound Chinook every day, 80-pound, right? So I'm 6'3", and you could hold them up and the tail would be in front of my face and the snout would be on the ground, right? Monster fish. And I just talked to somebody working in that area and said, "Oh yeah, those Cowichan Chinooks there." And he said, "Yeah, they're monsters." I said, "You bet they are." I said, "Yeah, some of those fish are 40 pounds, right? Half the size, one generation later." So, I mean, we need to learn from that. And I think that's the key, right? Is learning from what's gone on in the past and not being afraid, as you just said a little while ago, not being afraid to try things, like not being too cautious, right? To really push to make a difference. And whether that's in a governance model or with technical work or whatever, but salmon don't vote, right? Like, we are their advocates. And for millennia, salmon have supported British Columbians, right? We are certainly, the indigenous people are salmon people, right? And I think all British Columbians are salmon people. And I think the role has reversed, right? They've supported us forever, and now we need to support them. And it's people like you that are going to do that, right? So there's joy in that, right?
Yeah, there's joy and pressure.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Thinking about the future, just wrapping it up here, I sometimes find it very useful to imagine a utopia to get a target, for what we're aiming for. So in reference to the Cowichan, what does that future look like to you? Not a technical future, but what does it look like, feel like, smell like, sound like?
It's a future with salmon. It's a future where the Cowichan people can, practice their cultural life and support their spiritual needs on the river through salmon. It's a future where a child can walk down to the river in September and see the chum salmon swimming up the river. It's a future where there's enough water that everyone can have a healthy, sustainable lifestyle. And I think it's a future that we can achieve. And I think we're on the way to doing that. I think it's going to require strong leadership, and it's going to require change, right? We are going to have to change the way we do things, but we can. And I think we will.
Sounds like a good future. I'm looking forward to it. So one last question. Why are salmon more than a fish?
So salmon are a miracle. And I think a miracle is more than a fish. Salmon are a miracle because of their life history, right? Where they swim way out in the ocean, come back to the natal stream. Like, that's crazy. Salmon are a miracle because, here's one. So coastal streams in BC are ligotrophic. Because of the geology of our province, they're very, very nutrient poor. So there's not enough nutrients in our rivers and streams to support salmon. Full stop. The only reason we have salmon is because we have salmon. So they provide the nutrients. They bring en masse nutrients from the ocean into the rivers, right, to support themselves and other creatures. Like, that's a miracle. Like, that is not, like, you couldn't make that up if you try. So, salmon are more than a fish. They're a miracle that we can experience every day and that we need to really appreciate.
Great answer. This has been such a great conversation, and something that it's a conversation I feel like I wanted to have with you in December when I saw you kind of in the mingling zone at dinner. Couldn't pin you down there, but yeah. Are there any other closing thoughts about salmon or your time at the Cowichan that you'd like to sound off on before we go?
Maybe two things. The first one is I think it's worthwhile for technical people to support kind of governance initiatives. Because as we were speaking about earlier, the work we do cannot really be effective unless the community is behind us. So a lot of times we get siloed into our little area of expertise, but I think it's really important to think broader. And as I said earlier, to think about engaging community, to think about outreach work, and to think about governance, about how decisions are made that affect salmon. And I think that people like you and me and others who have technical expertise can really support those processes, and we should, and we usually don't. So that's one thought. And then the other thought is that I think that it's really important for all of us to tell our stories, right? I've been kind of telling a few stories here. You have a lot of good stories too. And I think it's important that we share them and share our perspectives with other people because they're valid. But more than that, more important than that, I think it's important that we listen to other people because you don't learn anything when you're talking and you learn a lot when you're listening. And that's one thing that the last 15 years of my career, I've forced myself to kind of talk less and listen more. And I'm a much better biologist for that, right? So those are my final thoughts.
Well, thanks, Tom, for the conversation.
You bet.
I want to acknowledge that this episode was recorded on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands.
Raincoast Radio is hosted by Auston Chhor and produced by me, Sophia Osborne. This podcast is a production of Raincoast Conservation Foundation, a team of conservationists and scientists empowered by research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. Learn more and support our work at raincoast.org.